A trail cook on a drive from San Antonio to Abilene in 1879 fed 12 men 3 meals a day for 98 days using a chuck box, 4 cast iron pots, a single Dutch oven, and a sack of flour. He had no refrigeration, no running water, and no oven. He cooked over open coals in winds that could blow a fire flat in seconds. Number 19 on this list kept beans from spoiling in a saddlebag for 9 days in August heat. Number 14 turned old hardtack back into bread overnight without an oven. Number 8 on this list let a cook bake biscuits underground while the herd was moving. These 25 tricks were so simple that food scientists in the 1990s ran controlled experiments to prove they worked. Hit subscribe before we get to number 1. Here are the 25 oddly useful cowboy cooking tricks. Number 25. The sourdough starter kept warm against the body. A trail cook on the Goodnight-loving trail carried his starter in a stoneware crock no bigger than your coffee mug. The crock rode inside a leather pouch tied to his ribs under his vest, where his own body heat kept the wild yeast alive on cold nights. The starter was older than the horse he rode. Some cooks kept the same culture working for 10 or 15 years, feeding it flour and warm water every 5 days, never letting it freeze, never letting it cook. A dead starter meant no biscuits, and no biscuits on a drive meant trouble in the dark. When researchers in the 1990s cultured a starter pulled from a Texas ranch crock that traced its lineage to 1882, they found a strain of lactic acid bacteria no commercial yeast company had ever isolated. The cook had only known to keep your jar warm. Your starter was the most valuable thing in the wagon. Number 24. Salt pork wrapped in cheesecloth and buried in flour. On a drive across the Llano Estacado, flies could ruin a side of pork in a single afternoon. The traditional fix worked like a pressure cooker, except in reverse. The cook wrapped each slab of cured pork in 2 layers of cheesecloth, then nested the bundle deep inside the open flour sack at the bottom of your chuck box. The flour absorbed any drip of moisture that broke through the cure, and the cloth was fine enough that no fly could lay eggs against the meat. The trick was passed down from naval cooks who had used the same method on long voyages out of New Bedford. A pound of salt pork bought for 12 cents at a frontier trading post in 1878 could last 3 weeks in your flour bag without an icebox. And the flour itself stayed clean, ready for the next morning's biscuits. Number 23. Hardtack soaked overnight in cold coffee. Hardtack was the worst food on the trail and the most reliable. Baked to a stone hardness so the moisture could not return, a cracker could ride your saddlebag for 2 years and still be edible the day you needed it. But the problem was the eating. Men called the biscuits sheet iron, worm castles, and tooth dullers, and the names were earned. The trick was simple. Last thing before bed, you dropped 2 crackers into the cold dregs of the coffee pot, set the pot on the chuck wagon step, and went to sleep. By dawn, the hardtack had drunk back nearly every drop of liquid in the pot, swelling soft enough to spread butter on. Old soldiers from the Civil War had taught the method to younger cowboys around the campfires of the 1870s. The cracker came back to life. The coffee was not wasted, and a man with no teeth left could eat his breakfast. Number 22. Spotted pup rice pudding with raisins. When the trail cook wanted to lift 12 tired men in one move, he made spotted pup. The recipe was rice, water, sugar or molasses, and a fistful of black raisins from your dried fruit barrel. The dark raisins scattered through the pale rice gave the pudding its name and its only visual joke. A 10-pound box of raisins cost 90 cents in Abilene in 1881 and could carry a crew through 2 weeks of drives, sweetening a pot every 3rd or 4th night. The cook baked it slow in a Dutch oven set deep in the embers, lid on, the steam softening every grain until the dish set up the way a custard sets in your mother's kitchen. Cowboys who lived through the worst trail seasons remembered spotted pup the way other men remembered Christmas. It was the only sweet thing they ate for months. A man would trade his coffee ration for a second helping. Number 21. The Arbuckle's peppermint stick bribe for grinding. Every 1-pound bag of Arbuckle's Ariosa coffee shipped out of Pittsburgh in the 1880s carried a single stick of red and white peppermint candy buried inside the beans, like a prize at the bottom of your cereal box. The candy was a marketing gimmick that became a social institution on every drive west of the Mississippi. The cook needed those whole roasted beans ground before every brew, and grinding was tedious work nobody wanted. So the cook would hold up the peppermint stick at first light and call out who wanted it. The first cowboy to volunteer to crank your iron grinder for 10 minutes won the candy. The trick gave the cook free labor and gave your men one bright moment of sweetness in an otherwise gray meal. By 1890, John Arbuckle had sold so much coffee through this single design choice that the brand became a generic name on the prairie. Cowboys did not ask for coffee, they asked for Arbuckles. Number 20. Bacon grease as universal seasoning and seal. Every chuck wagon carried a tin can with a wire handle hanging from a nail under the wagon bed. The can held bacon grease, and the grease was treated like gold. After every breakfast, the cook poured the hot drippings into the can, where they cooled and solidified into a creamy white seal the way a layer of paraffin protects your jar of homemade jam. That stack of layered fat could last a whole drive without going rancid because the air never reached anything but the freshest layer on top. Cowboys cooked beans in it, fried potatoes in it, smeared it on biscuits, and rubbed it on the cast iron when the seasoning thinned. Researchers at Texas A&M ran a study in 1996 on a sample of century-old grease pulled from a museum chuck box and found the bottom layer still chemically stable. One can, one method. A whole kitchen in a single greasy pound. Number 19. Beans rebrinned and parchment sealed for the saddlebag. On the longest stretch of the Western Trail, a section between the Red River and Dodge City that drive bosses called the Dry Drive, the chuck wagon could fall a full day behind the herd. Cowboys carried their own emergency rations in a small pouch tied behind your saddle, and the standard ration was a fist-sized portion of cooked pinto beans wrapped against an August sun that could cook your hand at noon. The trick the cooks had perfected by 1880 was older than the trade itself. First, the cook boiled the beans in a heavy salt brine, almost seawater strength, until they were cooked through but firm. Then he pressed them into a small square of waxed parchment, the kind butchers use to wrap your cuts, and sealed the parchment with a ring of cooled bacon grease. The salt drew water out of any bacterial cell that touched the bean. The grease shut out air the way candle wax shuts out moisture in a sealed jar. The parchment held it all together. A cowboy could ride for 9 days in August heat with that bundle against his thigh, and your beans would still be safe to eat. The University of Wyoming Food Science Department tested the method in 1994. They wrapped cooked pintos exactly the way a Texas trail cook would have wrapped them in 1885 and held the bundle at 104 degrees for 212 hours. The bacterial counts at the end of the test were lower than the counts on a refrigerated sample from the same kitchen. What most people miss is that the cook had not needed any of the chemistry. He had needed his men to stay alive between Wednesday and the next chuck wagon breakfast. Number 18. Cornmeal mush poured to set, then sliced and fried. On the morning a cook had no flour for biscuits and no time for sourdough, he reached for cornmeal. The night before, he stirred a pound of yellow meal into a gallon of boiling salted water and let it cook down for half an hour until the spoon stood up by itself. Then he poured the thick mush into a clean tin loaf pan and set it on your wagon step to harden in the cool prairie night. By dawn, the mush had set into a firm yellow brick. He turned it out, sliced it into half-inch slabs, and fried each slice in bacon grease until the outside crusted brown like a fresh-baked cornbread. Cowboys ate the slices with molasses or cane lick poured over the top. The same method worked in your Nebraska kitchen in 1934 with no refrigerator. The cook did the work at night, and your breakfast was already half done before he stoked the fire. Number 17. The spider skillet with 3 legs over coals. Before anyone called it a frying pan, it was a spider. Cast iron, flat-bottomed, with 3 short legs forged into the underside so the pan could sit straight on a bed of glowing wood coals. The legs were the whole trick. They lifted the cooking surface off the bottom of your fire pit, allowing air to circulate beneath and the coals to glow evenly without smothering. A cook on a drive could rake a small heap of embers, set the spider on top, and have a hot pan in 2 minutes. No stove, no grate, no burned bottom. The Pennsylvania foundries that cast these spiders in the 1860s sold them to outfitters in St. Louis for 90 cents apiece, and a single pan could last your trail cook 20 years. When Lodge began making modern cast iron in 1896, the design was already a century old. Number 16. Pemmican from buffalo, tallow, and chokecherries. The Plains tribes had perfected this food 1,000 years before any cowboy rode a longhorn north out of Texas. Strips of buffalo were dried in the sun until the meat shattered like glass when struck, then pounded to a coarse powder. Rendered tallow was poured over the powder in equal weight, mixed with handfuls of dried chokecherries or Saskatoon berries, and the whole mass was packed hot into a hide bag and sewn shut. The bag cooled into a brick that could last 5 years without refrigeration. Cowboys traded for pemmican at posts along the Powder River and the Yellowstone, paying $1 a pound for something that delivered 900 calories per ounce. A single brick in your saddlebag could carry you through a snowstorm that stranded the chuck wagon for a week. The fur trade companies of the 1840s could not have moved across Canada without it. Drive out the water. Coat the protein in fat. Number 15. Jerky strips knotted and dried in direct sun. When the cook had a fresh quarter of beef from a steer butchered on the range, he had to preserve every ounce inside 3 days or watch it spoil. The trick was to cut your meat against the grain into strips no thicker than a pencil. Dunk each strip in a brine of salt and black pepper. Then twist the wet strip into a knot before hanging. The knot served 2 purposes. It exposed more surface to the sun and wind, and it gave a clean place for a wire loop to pass through without slipping off. The strips hung from a wire stretched between 2 wagon poles, 4 feet off the ground, drying in low Texas humidity for 2 days until the meat turned dark and leathery as old saddle leather. You could carry a pound of jerky in your vest pocket for a month and eat it while your horse walked. Number 14. Hardtack rebaked overnight in coffee pot steam. This was the trick that turned the worst food on the trail into something a man would actually look forward to eating. Hardtack was designed to be inedible until rehydrated, and the standard rehydration meant a quick soak in coffee or a longer simmer in a pot of beans. Both methods produced something soggy and chalky. But around 1881, a chuck wagon cook on the LS Ranch in the Texas Panhandle discovered something different. He took 6 hardtack crackers, broke them into rough quarters, and dropped the pieces into a small Dutch oven with no liquid at all. He set the Dutch oven on your chuck wagon step, lid off, and put a tall coffee pot of fresh brewed coffee directly behind it on the warm side of the dying fire. As the coffee cooled overnight, the steam coming off the pot drifted across the open Dutch oven for hours, and the hardtack absorbed the moisture slowly from the air the way a sponge absorbs the humidity in your bathroom after a shower. By morning, the cracker pieces had swollen into something almost identical to fresh-baked bread. The starches had relaxed. The salt had distributed evenly. The outside was crisp where the steam had not reached, and the center was soft and warm. You could split a piece, butter it, and eat it with no soaking required. The technique reached the Texas Tech Food Science Department in 1991, where researchers ran a side-by-side test against fresh sourdough biscuits and found no measurable difference in moisture content, crumb structure, or palatability. And one trail cook had matched 100 years of bakery science with a coffee pot left out in the prairie air. Number 13. Son-of-a-gun stew from the innards. When a calf was butchered on the trail, the cook had 3 days to use every part of the animal that would not survive in salt. The muscle cuts went to the salt barrel. The innards went into your pot the very first night. The recipe became son-of-a-gun stew, named for a phrase no preacher would let into the kitchen tent in polite company. Heart, liver, brains, sweetbreads, tongue, and the marrow gut all simmered together for 3 or 4 hours over a low fire with onions and dried peppers and whatever flour was left from your morning biscuits. The marrow gut was the secret. As it cooked, it released a sweet, almost buttery flavor that bound the whole stew together like a roux binds your gravy. By the 1880s, the dish had spread from Texas chuck wagons to ranch kitchens across New Mexico and Colorado. They just ate. Number 12. Dried apple pie rehydrated in a Dutch oven. The dried apple barrel was the chuck wagon's pantry of last resort. Apples sliced thin and sun-dried in Missouri or Tennessee orchards, shipped west in 50-pound barrels and arrived hard as poker chips. The trick was to throw 2 cups of dried apple slices into your Dutch oven the night before Pie Day, cover them with a quart of water, and let them sit by the dying fire until morning. By sunrise, the apples had drunk back almost their original size. The cook tossed them with sugar, cinnamon, and a tablespoon of flour, wrapped the filling in a sourdough crust, and baked the pie under a lid loaded with hot coals. A trail crew of 12 men could go through a pie in 8 minutes flat. The cook never made one without making 2. The smell of cinnamon and apple drifted half a mile across the prairie like a dinner bell and brought every cowboy back to your camp on time. Number 11, eggshells dropped in the coffee pot. Coffee made over a campfire was bitter, gritty, and full of fine grounds that floated on top of every cup. The eggshell trick fixed all 3 problems at once. Before pouring, the cook crushed 2 or 3 clean eggshells into the bottom of your boiling pot. The calcium carbonate in the shells reacted with the natural acids in the brewed coffee, neutralizing the bitterness within 30 seconds. At the same time, the broken shell fragments sank, dragging fine grounds with them and leaving the top of the pot clear. By 1885, every chuck wagon east of the Pecos used the technique, and old trail cooks insisted no other method could match it. A team at the University of California ran a controlled study in 1998 and found the eggshell method reduced perceived acidity by nearly 30% without changing caffeine content. The cook had needed something that worked. The chemistry was a side effect. Number 10, salt-cured fresh meat with Army surplus salt. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States Army auctioned off thousands of barrels of preservation salt at frontier outposts from Fort Worth to Fort Laramie. A barrel that had cost the government $3 sold for 50 cents at the auction block. Trail cooks bought the surplus by the wagon load and used it for the next 20 years. The method was straight saturation curing. After a calf was butchered, the cook covered every cut in a thick layer of coarse salt, packed the salted meat into a wooden barrel, and let the salt draw the water out for 2 full weeks. The water drained through holes drilled in the bottom of your barrel. What came out was a hard, salty, shelf-stable cut that would hang in your ranch kitchen for a year without refrigeration. The Texas drives of the 1870s ran almost entirely on Army salt that had been intended for Confederate troops who never received it. Number 9, the chuck wagon 4-quadrant compartment box. Before Charles Goodnight bolted his first chuck box to the back of an Army wagon in 1866, no one had thought to organize a kitchen by function. Goodnight built a box 4 feet wide with a hinged lid that dropped down to make a work surface, and inside the box he carved out a 4-quadrant compartment system. Top left held flour and cornmeal in canvas sacks. Top right held coffee, sugar, salt, and pepper in tin cans with friction lids. Bottom left held the sourdough crock, the lard tin, and the molasses jug. Bottom right held tools, knives, and a small set of tin plates. The trick was the order. A cook who knew your chuck box could find any ingredient in the dark with one hand in less than 3 seconds. By 1875, every working chuck wagon in Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado had copied the same 4-quadrant layout. Number 8, pit-baked biscuits buried under dirt and coals. On a hot summer drive in central Kansas, the trail boss often needed the herd moving by dawn and gave the cook 1 hour to bake fresh biscuits for 14 men. There was no time to wait for a Dutch oven on a fire to come up to temperature. The trick the cooks had developed by 1880 was a method called pit baking, and it worked while the herd was already moving. At dusk the night before, the cook dug a shallow pit in your prairie sod, 18 inches across and a foot deep. He filled the pit with hardwood and let it burn down to a thick bed of coals. Just before sleeping, he set a covered Dutch oven full of unbaked biscuit dough into the pit, shoveled hot coals all around the sides and over the lid, and buried the whole arrangement under 6 inches of insulating dirt, the way a baker insulates a wood-fired oven with brick. By the time the herd was on its feet at sunrise, the buried oven had baked through a full batch of biscuits in the slow, even underground heat. The cook dug the Dutch oven out, brushed off the dirt, and lifted the lid to a perfect dome of golden biscuits, ready for your breakfast. The technique appeared in a Smithsonian article in 1993 that compared underground pit ovens to modern bread-proofing chambers. Number 7. Coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. The standard ratio on a working chuck wagon was 1 pound of ground arbuckles to 1 gallon of water, brewed in a 6-quart tin pot set directly into the coals. That ratio is roughly 4 times the strength of your modern American drip cup, and the resulting brew was thick, black, and slightly oily on the surface. Cowboys joked the coffee was strong enough to float a horseshoe. But the joke was rooted in a useful trick. The cook never threw out the grounds. He brewed the morning pot, decanted the cleared coffee, added fresh water and a half handful of fresh grounds to the same pot, and brewed again at the noon stop. He could repeat the process for 3 days running before the flavor failed, stretching 1 pound of beans across 36 cups instead of 12. Number 6. A lick of molasses as sweetener and seal. Every chuck wagon carried a clay jug of cane molasses, called lick by every cowboy who tasted it, and the jug had 2 distinct purposes. The first was sweetening. A spoonful in the spotted pup, a swirl over the fried mush, a tablespoon in your coffee on the morning a man was sick. The second was sealing. The cook would pour a thin film of molasses across the top of any jar of preserved fruit or pickled vegetable, and the sugar in the molasses created an oxygen barrier the way wax keeps your homemade preserves shelf-stable for another month. The same jug that sweetened a boy's birthday breakfast could shut out the air on your jar of cucumbers headed for the next ranch. Cane molasses cost 20 cents a quart in Galveston in 1880. 2 jobs from 1 jug. Number 5. 3-day starter beans that became 3 meals. The pinto bean pot on every chuck wagon was treated like a living thing, fed and watered and never quite finished. On day 1, the cook simmered 5 pounds of dried pintos with a pound of salt pork and a quart of water until the beans broke down into a thick stew. The men ate 2/3 of it that night. On day 2, the cook added another quart of water, half a cup of cornmeal for thickening, and the leftover diced potatoes from your breakfast. The beans returned as a thicker porridge for supper. On day 3, the cook mashed what was left, thinned it with milk or water, and served it as bean soup with biscuits on the side. 1 pot, 3 meals, 3 different flavors. By the time your pot was empty, the men had eaten 36 servings from a single 5-pound bag of beans. Number 4. Parched corn that traveled for months. The Plains tribes had been parching corn for centuries before any cowboy rode a Texas Longhorn. The method was simple. Whole dried corn kernels were tossed into a heavy iron skillet over a hot fire, stirred constantly until each kernel toasted golden brown and gave off a deep, nutty smell the way fresh popcorn does on your stove today. The heat drove out the last trace of moisture and locked the starches into a hard, shelf-stable cracker that would not spoil for a year. A cowboy kept a small leather pouch of parched corn in your saddlebag at all times and chewed a handful whenever the chuck wagon was out of reach. The corn delivered slow-release energy that kept your man in the saddle for 6 hours between meals. By 1885, every Texas drive carried 50 pounds of parched corn as a standard emergency ration. Number 3. Switchel of vinegar, ginger, molasses, and water. On a 100-degree day in West Texas, a cowboy who drank too much plain water could go down with heat sickness inside an hour. The chuck wagon answer was Switchel, a drink the New England farmers had brought west with them in the 1850s. The recipe barely qualified as cooking. 1 gallon of cold water, a 1/4 cup of apple cider vinegar, 2 tablespoons of fresh grated ginger root, and a half cup of molasses. Stirred, covered, and set in the shade of your chuck wagon. The vinegar replaced electrolytes a man sweated out. The ginger settled a stomach knotted by dust. The molasses delivered fast sugar that your muscles could burn through inside 10 minutes, the way a modern energy gel works on a marathon runner. Cornell sports physiologists in 1997 compared Switchel to commercial sports drinks and found the old recipe matched every metric on hydration and recovery time. Number 2. Sourdough biscuits with coals on the lid. The Dutch oven on a chuck wagon had no thermostat. The trick to baking even biscuits in a tool that was nothing more than an iron pot with a flat lid was to put the heat on both sides at once, the way a brick pizza oven heats from above and below. The cook raked a small bed of coals onto the prairie ground, set the Dutch oven on top, and shoveled a second layer of hot coals across your flat lid in a careful even ring. The ratio was 6 coals underneath and 18 coals on top, because biscuits cook best with more heat from above than from below. The cook rotated the pot a quarter turn every 5 minutes. 25 minutes later, the lid came off to reveal a dozen golden sourdough biscuits, evenly browned, perfectly risen. The same 6 and 18 ratio is taught today in Dutch oven cooking schools across the country. Number 1. The Chuck Wagon itself, 1866. Charles Goodnight bought a used Studebaker Army wagon in the spring of 1866 for the price of a good horse, took it to a carpenter in Weatherford, Texas, and asked the man to bolt a wooden box to the back end with a hinged lid that dropped down to make a work surface. That single piece of carpentry changed American food forever. Before the chuck wagon, a trail crew ate what each man carried in your saddlebag, and a long drive was limited by what one cowboy could pack on one horse. After the chuck wagon, a single mobile kitchen could feed a crew of 14 for 100 days across 2,000 miles of empty prairie. Every modern food truck in every American city is a direct descendant of Goodnight's wagon. He invented it all in a single afternoon and never patented any of it. The part few people talk about is what he asked for in return. His only request was that the cook on his crew be paid more than the cowboys. That trail cook from the 1879 drive to Abilene fed 12 men 3 meals a day for 98 days with a chuck box, 4 cast iron pots, a single Dutch oven, and a sack of flour, and every trick on this list passed through his hands at least once. The hardtack soaked in coffee, the beans wrapped in parchment, the biscuits buried under dirt, the coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. He worked alone, in the dark, under a wind that could blow a fire flat, and he never wrote a recipe down. Using gelatin to set leftover meat juices was an ingenious way to transform scraps into a new dish that stretched ingredients further. After roasting or boiling meat, the remaining juices were collected and combined with gelatin, which was more commonly used in wartime cooking than it is now. This mixture was poured into molds and refrigerated, creating savory aspects that could be sliced and served. These dishes added variety to meals and made use of parts that might otherwise be discarded. Gelatin helped preserve the nutrients and flavors, providing protein-rich options even when fresh meat was limited. The resulting aspects were often mixed with chopped vegetables, eggs, or bits of meat, making them more appealing and hearty. This technique reflected the resourcefulness of wartime kitchens, where wasting any part of food was unacceptable. Aspics served cold also offered a refreshing change in warmer months. Although gelatin dishes have faded from modern menus, they once held a respected place at tables across America. Rediscovering this trick shows how creativity and respect for ingredients helped families survive with less. Hominy was corn but tougher. It had to be soaked in lye, boiled until it puffed and split, then rinsed again and again to make it safe to eat. What came out was chewy, earthy, and just strange enough to feel like something ancient. It was not the kind of corn you threw on the cob. This was corn that had been through something. Fatback, on the other hand, was just what it sounded like: thick slices of pork fat, cured with enough salt to last through the hottest summers and coldest winters. On their own, each ingredient was rough. But together, they became a dish that worked like fuel. You layered the hominy and fatback in a pot, sometimes added a little grease or onion, and baked it until it bubbled up thick and heavy. The top might brown if the fire was hot enough, but even when it did not, nobody turned it down. It was dense, it was greasy, and it stuck to your ribs like armor. In a place where meals were counted in effort, not elegance, this one always showed up on time. It did not ask to be liked, just eaten. Railroad spike. Jerky was not made to be tender, it was made to last. The tougher the cut, the better it held up against heat, dust, and saddle sweat. They called it spike jerky because you could damn near break a tooth on it if you were not careful, and that was the whole point. Cowboys sliced meat thin, whatever they had, beef, buffalo, venison, and rubbed it down with salt, black pepper, and crushed sage leaves picked fresh from dry brush. Then they hung it near the fire, sometimes from iron nails hammered into wagon wheels, sometimes on stretched hide racks, letting the smoke do its slow magic. You kept it in your pocket, wrapped in cloth, a lifeline for the long ride. Jerky this hard was not a snack. It was fuel, protein packed into leather, and the slower you chewed, the more it gave back. When you bit into it under an open sky, dirt on your boots and sweat on your brow, you remembered what it felt like to earn every bite. Substituting butter with bacon drippings for cooking was a tasty and efficient way to replace scarce fats. Butter was rationed during World War II, forcing cooks to seek alternatives that could provide flavor and needed fat for cooking and baking. Bacon drippings, the fat rendered after frying bacon, were collected and saved for reuse in frying vegetables, seasoning beans, or baking savory dishes. This leftover fat added a smoky richness to meals that butter sometimes could not provide. Using bacon drippings was economical, preventing waste and making the most of limited resources. Families learned to store drippings carefully, sometimes mixing them with other fats to stretch them further. This substitution became a staple of wartime kitchens, balancing scarcity with flavor. Today, it serves as a reminder that necessity often inspires delicious creativity, turning something left over into a prized cooking ingredient. Rabbit was one of the few meats you did not have to buy. You trapped it, you skinned it, you cooked it over a low flame and gave thanks for every bite. Stewed rabbit with wild onions was a meal of real effort. Catching the meat was half the battle, but cleaning it was even harder. Once in the pot, the meat softened slowly, and the onions, dug from fields or creek beds, gave it a sweet, peppery edge. Sometimes folks added vinegar or dried apples just to stretch the flavor. You could serve it over biscuits or eat it straight from the pot. This was food for people who made do with what they had and did not ask for more. It was quiet, filling, and honest. A dish that reminded you that hunger does not care about preferences. You ate to keep going. You ate because something had to. You did not just fry a prairie hen. You hunted it, plucked it, gutted it, and prayed it did not come out tougher than your boots. Prairie hen and wild onion skillet fry was what you made when your rifle hit true and the weather stayed dry enough for kindling. The prairie hen was lean, sometimes scrawny, but it gave everything it had in the pan. The secret was the onions. Wild ones, dug up by hand, their bulbs still muddy, their stalks sharp with heat. You would clean the bird, split it, and sear it flat in bacon drippings or lard, tossing in thick slices of wild onion until the pan hissed with steam and grease. The smell alone could pull a drifter in from 10 miles out. This was the kind of dish that needed your full attention and both hands. One mistake and you would burn it to cinders. You ate it straight from the skillet, on your knees in the dirt, fingers dripping. It was not pretty, but it was the closest thing to a feast on the open plains. Creating homemade mustard from mustard seeds was a clever, cost-saving way to add flavor when store-bought condiments were scarce. Mustard seeds were inexpensive and could be ground at home to make fresh mustard pastes of varying heat and intensity. This homemade version was used to season meats, dress vegetables, and enliven sandwiches. Making mustard from scratch gave cooks control over the ingredients and helped avoid reliance on rationed or imported products. Mustard's sharpness also helped mask the blandness or substitutions often found in wartime dishes. Many families learned to prepare and store their own mustard, turning a simple seed into a pantry essential. This practice encouraged self-sufficiency and brought bold flavor to otherwise plain meals. Homemade mustard's popularity during the war reminds us that small touches can make a big difference in food enjoyment, especially when resources are tight. You might wrinkle your nose, but fried rattlesnake was a real meal on the frontier. If you were living off the land, you ate what the land gave you, and sometimes that meant a coiled-up surprise near your boots. Rattlesnake meat was surprisingly tender and mild, almost like chicken, and once you peeled the skin and cleaned the bones, it fried up fast. Cornmeal crust gave it crunch, and a sprinkle of pepper or dried herbs gave it flavor. Folks who lived near the desert or in rocky canyons got used to seeing these snakes. Some made it a sport to hunt them, others just got desperate enough to try. Either way, you dipped the meat in egg, rolled it in cornmeal, and dropped it in hot fat. It sizzled, popped, and came out golden. Eaten with dandelion greens or roasted roots, it was more than just edible. It was a story. One you told around a fire long after the danger was gone. Beans were not just beans on the trail. They were survival. Slow cooked in a cast iron pot buried half in the coals, stirred with a stick, and hardened by hours of dust and sun. Campfire beans with burnt molasses crust were the crown jewel of any night under the stars. You started with dried beans, pinto, navy, whatever you had, soaked in river water and tossed into the pot with salt pork or maybe just a hunk of lard. Then came the molasses. Thick, dark, bittersweet. Not a drizzle. A full slug from the bottle. The beans simmered for hours until they thickened into a sticky, smoky stew with a crust so dark it looked burnt. Because it was. But that was the whole point. That crust was gold. You cracked through it with your spoon and underneath was pure comfort, soft, rich beans coated in a syrupy glaze of salt, smoke, and sugar. No one ever went to bed hungry when the beans came out right. They were sweet. They were heavy. They stuck to the bottom of your plate and the roof of your mouth. And when you finished scraping the pot clean, you knew you had eaten something that would carry you to the next town. Dehydrating fruits for long-term storage was a clever preservation method that helped families save their garden bounty for the winter months. Fresh fruits like apples, berries, and peaches were sliced thin and dried to remove moisture, preventing spoilage. This process concentrated the sweetness and flavor while extending shelf life without refrigeration. Dehydrated fruits were used in baking, stews, and snacks, adding natural sugars and vitamins to otherwise plain wartime diets. The practice required patience but paid off by providing nutritious ingredients when fresh produce was unavailable. Many families set up simple drying racks in sunny windows or outdoors during the warmer seasons. Dehydration also reduced bulk and weight, making fruits easier to store in limited pantry spaces. This preservation technique was a testament to the resourcefulness of home cooks determined to maximize their harvest. Today, dried fruits remain popular, but the wartime origin highlights how necessity fostered smart food conservation strategies. This was not an everyday dinner. Buffalo meat was a rare and sacred thing, hunted with care and shared with reverence. When settlers got their hands on some, they treated it like a holiday. The roast was slow cooked over fire or buried in a pit with hot stones, and the juices were thickened into a gravy using wild juniper berries crushed with a rock or spoon. The result was smoky, slightly bitter, and rich beyond measure. Juniper gave it that wild taste, something sharp, something old. This dish came from a time when nothing was farmed and everything was earned. It fed big families, whole camps, or traveling parties headed west. Nobody wasted a bite, and nobody ever forgot the taste. Black-eyed peas were not just lucky, they were necessary. They were tough, cheap, and stubborn enough to thrive in the worst dirt the frontier had to offer. Cowboys mashed them by the fire, their skins cracked from long boils in iron pots. The salt pork gave them the only fat they were likely to see that day, cut from slabs carried in canvas and sliced with pocket knives slick from use. When the beans softened into paste, a rough mash was born, salty, starchy, and just hearty enough to fill a gut hollowed out by trail miles. The real kicker was the gravy, coffee gravy. Yes, actual boiled coffee, thickened with bacon drippings and a scrap of flour if the cook was flush. Bitter, rich, and bracing like a slap to the jaw, it turned the mash into a dish that could wake the dead. There was no cream, no butter, no comfort, really. But there was warmth. There was weight. It was food that stood its ground. Out there, meals had to mean something. You did not eat because you were hungry. You ate to stay on your horse, to keep from freezing, to keep from fading. Black-eyed pea mash was your answer to all three. Making war ration sandwich spreads was a clever way to turn limited ingredients into something satisfying. People would blend canned fish, often salmon or mackerel, with whatever vegetables were on hand, like pickles or onions. Mayonnaise substitutes made from rationed ingredients helped bind it all together. This mixture stretched thinly over bread, turning simple sandwiches into meals that could fill bellies without breaking wartime restrictions. The beauty of these spreads was their adaptability. If fresh produce was scarce, canned or preserved vegetables stepped in. The result was a flavorful, nutritious option that made the most of pantry staples. These spreads were also easy to prepare, which helped busy families feed themselves quickly. They became a staple at lunchtime tables across the country, proving that resourcefulness could turn the leanest rations into something worth eating. The practice encouraged creativity and minimized waste, both essential during the war. Today, these simple sandwich spreads remind us of a time when making do was not just a choice, but a necessity. Trying out these recipes can give us a taste of resilience and cleverness from kitchens of the past. Prairie chicken was not chicken at all. It was wild grouse or quail, lean and gamey, and harder to catch than it was to cook. These birds were everywhere across the plains in the early days, and they fed whole families with just one shot and a lucky morning. The dressing, what we would now call stuffing, was made with old bread, sage, and whatever herbs you could find or grow in the yard. When it was baked in a cast-iron Dutch oven, the whole cabin would fill with the kind of scent that stopped everyone in their tracks. This meal showed up on tables for Sunday dinner or after a good hunting day. It reminded folks of home, even if that home was just four walls and a dirt floor. The meat might have been tough, the bread might have been stale, but put them together with sage and heat, and they made magic. No one complained. Not when it filled your belly and made the cold nights feel shorter. A real Cowboy's sourdough starter did not live in a glass jar on a windowsill. It rode in a tin wrapped in cloth, buried in saddle packs, fed with flour and breath and thyme. That starter was a lifeline, passed down, guarded, grown like a secret. When campfire mornings hit with cold winds and stiff joints, the bedroll tin came out. A scoop of starter, some flour, water, salt, maybe a splash of molasses if you were lucky, and the batter was born. You poured it straight onto a greased skillet laid over firewood flames and watched it bubble and brown like a living thing. The cook would hand them out by the stack, slapping them into tin plates with a grunt, and nobody ever complained. Because out on the trail, a sourdough pancake meant you made it one more night, one more fire, one more morning. And if you had your bedroll tin, you had a reason to keep going. Boiling potatoes with their skins to retain nutrients was a practical trick to maximize the nutritional value during rationing. Removing skins before cooking often wasted the fiber and vitamins that resided in and just under the potato skin. By boiling them whole with the skins on, families kept more nutrients intact, making every bite count. This method also reduced preparation time and minimized waste in kitchens where every resource mattered. After cooking, the skins were peeled off easily, sometimes used in other dishes or composted. Potatoes were a staple wartime food due to their availability and ability to grow in many regions. This simple step ensured that their health benefits were not lost in the cooking process. The technique showed how attention to detail in the kitchen could stretch limited food into a more nourishing meal. Today, many cooks appreciate this method for both nutrition and flavor, keeping a small wartime secret alive. This was the beating heart of cowboy cooking. Beans and bacon went everywhere, from wagon trains to cattle drives to back porch suppers. You started with pinto beans, dried and soaked overnight if you had the time. They were tossed into a big pot with water and a heavy slab of salt-cured bacon. That bacon was not the kind you fry for breakfast. It was dense, brined, and meant to last. As it cooked, the beans soaked up all the fat and salt, turning soft and smoky. You stirred it with a wooden spoon, checked the fire, and hoped it would be done by sundown. There were no frills, just beans, pork, and patience. If you had a biscuit or a chunk of cornbread on the side, you counted yourself lucky. This was a meal that stuck with you, gave you warmth, and made sure you could ride or work all the next day. The desert gives you exactly nothing unless you learn how to ask nicely. That is why cowboys learned to fry cactus. Skillet-fried cactus and lard-roasted garlic shoots was not born out of creativity. It was born out of bone-deep hunger. The prickly pear paddles had to be sliced and scraped, every thorn removed with care, the green flesh cut into thin strips and soaked in water to tame the bitterness. Garlic shoots were pulled from dusty soil, long and wiry, sharp with flavor. They were roasted in bacon fat or lard until they curled and browned like desert kindling. Then the cactus strips went in, sizzling and shrinking, softening into something halfway between a pepper and a green bean. The result was tangy, chewy, rich, and surprisingly filling. It was a meal that came from a place most would never look. Cowboys ate it in silence, watching the fire dance, chewing slowly, grateful for the land's strange generosity. When you learn to make something beautiful out of something that wants to hurt you, you carry that with you. Every bite of cactus and garlic was proof. You knew how to survive where others saw nothing but sand. Using cabbage leaves as wraps for stuffed vegetables was a natural and economical way to hold ingredients together during times of scarcity. Large cabbage leaves served as edible containers for mixtures of grains, vegetables, and sometimes small amounts of meat. Wrapping dishes this way conserved cooking vessels and made serving easier. The leaves added a mild, fresh flavor and extra fiber to meals. Cabbage was widely available, inexpensive, and hearty, making it a perfect vegetable to support this technique. Stuffed cabbage leaves were filling and visually appealing, offering a sense of comfort despite limited ingredients. This method also reflected the wartime emphasis on stretching every resource without waste. Many families passed down recipes that used cabbage wraps, keeping the tradition alive long after rationing ended. Revisiting this trick today reveals how simple, affordable vegetables became heroes in kitchens facing adversity. This was no frozen grocery store pie. Venison pot pie came from hunters and homesteaders, made with fresh-shot deer meat that had been stewed for hours over low heat. It was mixed with carrots, potatoes, or wild onions if you had them, and poured into a rough pie crust made from flour and lard. The crust was thick, never flaky, and it needed to be. It had to hold up against days-old stew and keep well without a refrigerator. The pie would bake in a heavy Dutch oven, often buried in coals, while the smell filled the entire cabin. It was a special dinner, usually reserved for after a good hunt or around holidays when families gathered. You could slice it like cake and serve it warm or cold. It tasted like salt, smoke, and hard-earned luck. If you had enough venison to make two, you stored one under a towel for the next day. No one ever said no to a second helping. They did not bake biscuits. They scorched them in ashes and trusted the fire to tell them when they were ready. Chuckwagon biscuits were not like the golden fluffy kind you find at a drive-thru. These were tough, dense, dusty. But they were also the one thing that could survive a week-long trail ride without turning into a brick or crumbling into flour. Cowboys mixed them up at dawn: flour, lard, salt, maybe a splash of buttermilk if the cook was feeling generous, and they dropped them straight onto cast-iron skillets buried in coals. No oven, no timer, just fire, iron, and instinct. What came out was smoky, dry, and just perfect for sopping up greasy beans or that morning's bacon grease. Sometimes the cowhands would wrap the dough in cloth and wedge it next to hot rocks in the fire pit. These biscuits were not soft, but neither were the people who baked them. And when you tore one open with blackened fingers, it tasted like grit, dust, and victory. Stretching meatloaf with oats or breadcrumbs was a common tactic to make meat supplies go further during the shortages. When meat was scarce and expensive, people found that adding oats or breadcrumbs bulked up the mixture, making a smaller amount of ground meat feed a whole family. These fillers were inexpensive and readily available, making them perfect wartime kitchen helpers. Oats added texture and absorbed flavors, while breadcrumbs helped bind the loaf together, keeping it moist and filling. Seasonings and vegetables mixed in also helped improve the taste and nutritional value. This clever trick allowed households to serve a classic comfort food without using as much precious meat. It also introduced more fiber and whole grains into the diet, which was an unintended bonus. The stretched meatloaf became a symbol of frugality and culinary ingenuity, showing how people adapted familiar recipes to hard times. It was a meal that provided warmth and sustenance when resources were limited. Trying this method today offers a glimpse into how much thought went into conserving food during those challenging years. Sourdough was the cowboy's best friend, and not just for bread. You could take a little jar of starter across states and still have breakfast wherever you went. These flapjacks were not sweet or soft. They were chewy, dense, and packed with tang from the ferment. Fried right on a skillet greased with leftover pork fat, they went great with salt pork slices, heavily salted meat that was soaked and boiled until edible. Nobody called it elegant, but it worked. Cowboys ate it in the morning if they were lucky, or as a dinner when rations ran low. Salt pork was cheap, kept forever, and did not need refrigeration, which meant it could follow you to the middle of nowhere. These meals were eaten sitting on the ground, leaning against your saddle, with the fire crackling just out of reach. You did not eat for flavor. You ate because tomorrow was another 10 miles and you were already sore. This was fuel, not a feast, but it was also comfort in a place where comfort was rare. Apple leather was not candy. It was not pie. It was something in between, a trail snack pressed from desperation and wrapped in cloth like gold. Stagecoach trail apple leather rolls were what you made when apples were bruised, battered, and almost gone bad. You peeled them, cored them, and boiled them down to a thick, dark mush with sugar if you had it, or honey if you were lucky. Then you spread that hot mash thin on greased pans or sheets of tin and set them in the sun, sometimes on rocks, sometimes on wagon roofs. The sun did the rest. It baked and dried the apples into chewy strips, dark and rich, with just enough tang to make your mouth water. You rolled them up and tied them with twine. They kept for weeks. They tasted like apple pie if you closed your eyes hard enough. Cowboys would chew them slow on the trail, letting the sugar settle their stomachs and the memory of home settle their nerves. It was not much, but it was sweet, and sometimes that was all you needed. Cooking cornmeal. Spoon bread as a bread substitute was a clever way to fill the gap when traditional bread was scarce during wartime. Spoon bread was a soft, moist baked dish made from cornmeal, milk, eggs, and butter or fat, creating a texture somewhere between cornbread and a soufflé. This dish was easy to make with pantry staples and required less flour than typical bread recipes, making it perfect for rationing times. Spoon bread was served alongside soups, stews, and main dishes, providing a comforting and filling accompaniment. Its creamy texture and mild flavor made it a favorite substitute for conventional bread, which was often unavailable or in limited supply. This recipe also showcased the versatility of cornmeal, an inexpensive and widely available ingredient that became a backbone for many wartime meals. Spoon bread required simple equipment and minimal preparation time, fitting well into the busy schedules of wartime cooks. Today, it is remembered as a nostalgic comfort food, a symbol of how kitchens adapted with creative substitutes to maintain hearty meals. Riverside meals were always about what you could pull out of the water, and catfish was as good as it got. Thick-bodied, whiskered, and slippery, they were a challenge to catch but worth every second of the fight. Once cleaned, the fillets were dunked in flour or cornmeal and fried in a skillet over open flame until they sizzled brown at the edges. The oil crackled, and the fish turned crisp on the outside and soft as butter inside. What made this dish stand out, though, was the sorghum vinegar sauce. Made from syrup cooked down with sharp vinegar and sometimes a dash of wild herbs, it was poured over the catfish just before eating. The sweetness hit first, then the tang, then the smoke from the fire itself. It was an evening meal that brought comfort after long days of river labor or ferry hauls. Served with beans or wild greens, it was not fancy, but it had bite. And in a world where meat came with risk, the catfish was a dependable gift. If you knew how to clean it right, season it just enough, and keep your fire steady, you could turn a slippery catch into something you would dream about again tomorrow. Buffalo tallow was not just for lanterns or leatherwork, it was a frontier kitchen's secret weapon. When cowboys fried their corn cakes in buffalo fat, they were not just feeding themselves, they were paying respect to the beast that gave them warmth, meat, tools, and oil. The fat was rendered down slow and clean until it turned clear as gold, and then it hit the pan with a hiss so sharp it could wake the dead. Into that blazing heat went gritty cornmeal batter, sometimes mixed with buttermilk, sometimes just water and salt, depending on the day's luck. The edges crisped into lace. The center stayed soft and warm. But the flavor, earthy, wild, deep like wood smoke and prairie dust, came from that buffalo tallow. Cowboys would drizzle sorghum syrup over the top when they had it, that thick, dark sweetness cutting through the meatiness of the fry. It was sweet, salty, fried in the ghost of something mighty, and it stuck to your ribs like you had just eaten thunder. Cooking with pressure. Cookers for efficiency became a valuable trick during World War II when fuel and time were limited. Pressure cookers reduced cooking times drastically by trapping steam and raising the boiling point of water. This meant tougher cuts of meat and dried beans could be prepared quickly, saving both energy and precious time. Many families learned to use pressure cookers to stretch ingredients further, making dishes that would otherwise take hours on the stove. These pots also helped preserve nutrients that might be lost during longer cooking. The ability to prepare a hearty meal fast was essential when rationing limited both fuel and food. Pressure cookers became common in wartime kitchens, praised for their practicality and convenience. Today, while electric appliances have taken over, the principles of pressure cooking remain a reminder of how innovation met necessity. Using a pressure cooker was not just about speed, it was about making the most of scarce resources and easing daily burdens in difficult times. Cornmeal mush was the grit beneath the grit. You boiled it into a thick, almost rubbery porridge that could be eaten hot with butter or poured into a tin, chilled overnight and sliced for frying. On cold frontier mornings, it was the fastest way to feed a family and keep them moving. Add a slice of sausage, pan-fried and dripping with molasses, and you had something that felt like luxury. This was the kind of meal you ate before walking into a snowstorm, cutting wood, or birthing a calf. It was hot, sticky, and stuck in your teeth, but you would not complain. Molasses was easier to find than sugar and lasted longer in the pantry. That one spoonful made you feel like everything was just a little sweeter than it was. This dish might sound plain, but back then it tasted like gold. There is something wild, reckless, and a little bit terrifying about son-of-a-gun stew. This was not a dish with a recipe. It was a dare cooked over open fire. Cowboys did not ask what was in it. They just ate it, scraped the bowl clean, and moved on before they had time to think. The stew was born from desperation and the rule of the range: waste nothing. That meant everything went in: tongue, liver, heart, marrow, bones, kidneys, every last edible part of the steer simmered down in a cast iron pot until it surrendered to flavor. And somehow it worked. It worked because these men knew how to tame a fire, knew how to season meat with little more than salt, pepper, and smoke. There are not many dishes that carry as much grit and guts as this one. You did not eat son-of-a-gun stew because you were hungry. You ate it because you were alive, and it was proof you still had your nerve. Making fruit butter from overripe fruit was a smart way to turn imperfect or aging fruit into a delicious and long-lasting spread. Instead of letting fruit go to waste, wartime cooks slowly cooked down overripe apples, peaches, or pears with just a small amount of sugar to create a thick, flavorful butter. The low sugar content was intentional, as sugar was rationed and often in short supply, so cooks had to find ways to sweeten food without using much of it. This spread could be used on bread, served with biscuits, or added to breakfast dishes, giving meals extra flavor and variety. The process also helped preserve the fruit for longer periods, making it a practical pantry staple. Families often experimented with whatever fruit was on hand, and the resulting fruit butters became a cherished way to stretch food supplies while still enjoying sweet flavors. Making fruit butter was a testament to the creativity in wartime kitchens, turning potential waste into something nourishing and tasty. This tradition carries on in many homes today, keeping the spirit of resourcefulness alive. Scrapple was the kind of thing you either grew up on or would never understand. It was a loaf made of pork scraps, cornmeal, and seasoning, formed into a block, chilled overnight, then sliced and fried thick in a pan. The result was something between a meatloaf and a fried cake, with crispy edges and a soft, savory middle. The gravy was simple. You took the drippings left in the pan, added some flour and water, and stirred until it bubbled. That was poured straight over the scrapple like syrup on pancakes. There was no polite way to eat it. You cut it, scooped it, and sopped it up with whatever you had. It was greasy, dense, and completely satisfying. Scrapple came from people who knew that meat did not end with the tender cuts. It was a poor man's roast, made with brains, hearts, or necks, if that was all you had. But no one dared call it second-rate. It was breakfast, lunch, or dinner depending on the day. And when the weather was cruel and the wood was wet, scrapple and gravy reminded you that with a little time and grease, even scraps could become something worth waiting for. No trout ever tasted sweeter than the ones caught at dawn and grilled over mesquite with leaves still wet from the riverbank. This was a meal born of patience and quiet, a cowboy kneeling in icy water, hands numb, waiting for the flick of silver in a shadowed stream. When the trout came, you did not waste time. You gutted it, cleaned it, and stuffed it with wild herbs if you had them. But the trick was in the wrap. Large riverbank leaves, pliable and green, folded the fish like parchment. You tied it shut with strips of grass and placed it right on a slab of hot rock over the fire. When the leaves crisped and darkened, it was done. The trout flaked apart with a fork or a stick, tender and fragrant and bright with smoke. There were no sides, no sauces, just fish, fire, and the wild morning air. It was not fancy, but it tasted like something pulled straight from the hand of the earth itself. Pemmican was survival food at its most basic: dried meat, fat, and berries mashed into cakes that could last for months without spoiling. But out on the frontier, folks found ways to turn it into something hot and hearty when supplies ran low. Enter the pemmican hot dish, which was exactly what it sounded like. Pemmican fried up in a skillet with whatever else was on hand: onions, turnips, wild greens, or even a spoonful of leftover beans. The meat, usually deer or buffalo, had been dried until leathery and ground into pieces. The fat came from tallow, rendered down in iron pots until it was clear and clean. It all came together in one sizzling, heavy pan. It did not smell great, but it tasted like energy, and it gave you the strength to do whatever was needed the next day. You could eat it with a biscuit or flatbread if you had any left, but often you just scooped it straight from the pan with your knife. This was the kind of food you made when there was no room for complaints. You ate it quietly, with the fire spitting and the wind outside your cabin walls. It filled the space where comfort used to live. Making hobo stew with mixed vegetables and meat scraps was a one-pot meal that brought together whatever was on hand to feed families efficiently. This stew combined less desirable cuts of meat, leftover vegetables, and pantry staples simmered slowly to develop flavor and tenderness. The name reflected its humble origins, but the dish was hearty and comforting. Using a single pot minimized fuel usage and cleanup time, which were valuable considerations during wartime. The flexible recipe meant cooks could adapt it to what was available, reducing waste and stretching ingredients. Hobo stew embodied the spirit of making do with less and turning scarcity into sustenance. Its warming qualities made it a favorite in many homes, especially during cold months. Today, it stands as a symbol of resilience and practical cooking wisdom from a time when every morsel mattered. These 25 tricks were the kitchen of a country still figuring out how to feed itself, and most of them still work in your kitchen today.